Dear friends, Paul's letter to the Romans has inspired more than one theologian. Augustine, Luther, Calvin are just three of its famous interpreters. They have based their entire theology, their determinate image of God and human justification, on this letter. It has it all. Within its 16 short chapters, and even the 14 verses of chapter 8 that we just have listened to, it contains the whole of Christian faith, from creation, through human sinfulness according to the flesh, to the final redemption of our bodies, from God Father, through Jesus the Son, to the Spirit of hope. Paul's message comes to us like a birthday present, so well wrapped in that the present itself is almost hidden at first sight. Paul's language is so rich in content that almost each of these 14 verses could be enough to nourish a long sermon, while all of them together form one large argument that Paul establishes in order to prove the truth of the Christian gospel. He does so by referring to everyday human experience. Paul, the theologian, is at the same time Paul, the ordinary man, with a rich psychological insight. When Paul speaks of fear, of suffering, of labor pains, of the need of redemption, and of the necessity to wait for the good with patience, a sad necessity, then he recalls his own struggles in life. And if Paul's words have inspired more than one, it is due to the fact that Paul's analysis of human struggling has proved compelling to so many. So let us try today to unwrap his message. And let's start right at the beginning, when Paul speaks of a life wrongly led according to the flesh. Those of you who have been here last Sunday may remember Andy's preaching on the beginning of Romans 8. Paul's distinction of flesh and spirit is present right from the beginning of this chapter, and Andy emphasized how important it is to get this distinction right. I'd like to follow up on Andy's preaching today. Indeed, if you want to understand Paul, you must start right here. What does it mean living according to the flesh? And why does such a life led according to the flesh end up in slavery and death, as Paul states? It would be a huge mistake to understand Paul's idea of flesh literally and to take it as just another expression for the body and its passions. There is a long tradition in almost all Christian churches to understand Paul this way and to attribute to Paul a theology and ethics that are fearful of the body and hostile to its needs and pleasures. For this theological tradition, ascetic monkhood is the best way to live out the Christian faith. But Paul uses two different words for flesh and for body. In the Greek origin of Paul's letters, soma stands for the body and sarx stands for the flesh. And although it is true that Paul is particularly attentive to the fact that the body can be the center of a life according to the flesh, he does not mix them into one. He even calls the body a holy temple of the Spirit in 1 Corinthians 6. At the same time, Paul is well aware that a so-called spiritual life, perhaps a life spent in monkhood, can actually be led very much according to the flesh. He recalls his own life as a Pharisee when he boasted of his seemingly spiritual accomplishments as an example of such a wrongful life. He thought to be a very religious man by that time, pleasing God by observing every letter of the law, and by persecuting the first Christians. After his encounter with Christ, however, Paul realized that all this religious zeal actually was leading in the wrong direction. What seemed to be a religious accomplishment was actually pulling him away from God. Paul learned from this self-experience, and we can learn from him. Religious zeal and even a life spent entirely according to the letter of God's commandments is not a sure sign of being close to God and his Spirit. The spiritual facade sometimes hides a very fleshly attitude of superiority. You can be a pillar of the church and still live according to the flesh when you serve the church with the wrong attitude. Indeed, what Paul describes as flesh is neither a specific part of the body nor a particular seizable entity. It is an attitude or a perspective in which you look at things and other persons. The flesh is like glasses you put on. Let's take sunglasses. If you put them on, you have a completely different perception of the world around you. Everything looks much darker. And I'm even about to complain about this church that has no proper lighting in his sanctuary. But of course, everything changes if I take off the glasses and I see, no, at least for the lighting, this church is a good place. Or let's take those halls of mirrors you can walk into in some amusement parks. The curved mirrors distort the physical reality. You can be slim as a twig, and you still appear fat in some of those mirrors. To live according to the flesh means to live in a permanent condition of distortion. It means that you see yourself and the world around you in the wrong way. Flesh is a wrong perspective of seeing the world that deeply influences our beliefs and attitudes. And what kind of distortion is meant here? When we have a closer look on Paul's remarks on the flesh in his letters, it comes out that he associates the perspective of the flesh with two specific human attitudes: coveting and boasting. What's wrong with coveting? Well, if you covet something, you want it for your own, you want to possess it. And boasting? If you boast of something you have accomplished, you compare yourself to others and you want to claim superiority over them. Let's take the current fitness trend, working together with the possibility to take selfies. More and more people like to expose their well-trained body on Instagram and other platforms in order to show their progress towards a perfect body. See what I have accomplished. Or take the trend to overemphasize your professional skills on platforms like LinkedIn. For Paul, all this would be boasting, and therefore according to the flesh. Both coveting and boasting have their common characteristic in their self-centeredness. I envy somebody else's possession, and I want to show how good I am. I cannot live knowing somebody else has something I don't. It's like living with permanent reflective glasses, mirrors right in front of my eyes that refer me constantly to myself. How do I fare in this activity? What profit do I gain from it? How am I to be judged compared to others? Paul is very critical towards such an attitude of self-centeredness. For him, it is equivalent to sin. And this is not a purely theological argument. Paul makes a connection between living according to the flesh, fear, and slavery. Self-centeredness, according to Paul, is a sort of imprisonment. And isn't that true? When I am preoccupied by observing my own progress, be it push-ups in the gym or hours spent for the church, then I risk losing track with the people around me. Legitimate self-observation may in the end become an obsession, and in the end I see myself rather alone in the world, imprisoned by my reflective glasses, a lone rider in a world where only exceptional performances matter and where I live in constant fear of not measuring up to everyone else. And we in the church should not be too ready to assume that only others think and behave like this. When Paul writes to the Christian community in Rome about coveting and boasting, he thinks that this fleshly attitude is a danger for Christians as well. In a church, coveting and boasting may happen in a more subtle way than by posing photos on Instagram, but they still do happen. For example, when a church becomes obsessed and complacent about its growth. Paul does not stop here. Instead of leaving us with his analysis of human sinfulness, he shows an alternative perspective, alternative glasses, to live according not to the flesh, but to the Spirit. Paul uses very strong words to describe this new spirit that is given to the world in Jesus Christ. First of all, it's a spirit of trust and not of fear and competition. Abba is the Aramaic equivalent to daddy. And if we are allowed to call God Abba, our daddy, we can trust that he will care for us independently of our failures. Instead of observing ourselves, we can hope and wait for God to accomplish things where we are struggling. We live in a relationship of gift and not of fear. The spirit of trust is also a spirit of communion. God takes away the reflective glasses, frees us from our self-imprisonment, and opens ourselves to an attitude of universal solidarity. Paul even includes the whole of creation into this universal solidarity. And this is very, very peculiar in this passage in Romans 8. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now, he says. In times of climate change, we understand better than ever that we are not alone in the world, but that human sin has immediate consequences for the world we live in, not only for humans, but for animals, plants, and landscapes as well. There is one world we live in, and living according to the Spirit means to be conscious of our solidarity with all of creation and to live accordingly. We live in a relationship of communion and not of competition or exploitation. Trust and communion are the signs of a life in the Spirit of God. Paul asks us to change the perspective from the reflective glasses of the flesh to the open space and the undivided heart provided by the Spirit. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption. How does the parable of the weeds, today's gospel, relate to Paul's message of hope? The furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, isn't it this image that created a long-standing tradition of fear and performance-seeking in the church? Just the opposite of relationship of trust and hope. I don't know how you felt, but we received the gospel with a joyful song. But at the end of the gospel, it was quite heavy, what was told us. So what do we do with this gospel, this announcement of hell and eternal judgment, when we have on the other side this very promising message of Paul? And by speaking in the gospel of us, the righteous, and them, the evildoers, doesn't this gospel cement feelings of religious superiority instead of Paul's spirit of communion? Well, I do have a problem with bringing Matthew and Paul together at this point. But there is one way of interpreting the parable of the weeds that could somehow dissolve the tension. I'd like to suggest taking the bad wheat in the parable not as an image of other people who represent the devil on earth and will be thrown into the furnace at the end of the time. Rather, I suggest taking the weed for the bad ideas every one of us carries in his or her heart. There's nobody on earth who is not affected by sin. But there will be a time when we are cleansed from our iniquities and when they will disappear like smoke rising from a fire. The weeds in the parable signify the enemy within, rather than concrete people around us. Read in this sense, the parable of the weeds does not contradict Paul's message of trust and hope. It rather confirms that notion of Abba, a God Daddy who helps out where we fail. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, may guard your hearts and your minds in Jesus Christ. Amen.